I'm Kathy Maxwell.
I'm Nathan Maxwell,
And welcome to the Good Faith Bible Study Podcast,
where we'll offer a few additional insights about the Bible study lessons from Good Faith Magazine.
Get the magazine and learn more at goodfaithmedia.org. This lesson, The New Community, is for March 2nd, 2025. The focal passage is Matthew 5, 1 through 12. The Sermon on the Mount is perhaps the most challenging of all Jesus' teaching. This week, we're only looking at the opening verses, the Beatitudes, maybe the most famous section of this famous sermon from Matthew's Gospel. But it's worth taking a moment to think about how to understand the sermon as a whole. Each of the Gospels emphasize a different aspect of Jesus and his ministry. In fact, Luke chapter 6 contains a very similar passage, often called the Sermon on the Plain. So as we approach the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, we have to ask, who is the Jesus who preaches this message in Matthew's Gospel? In Matthew chapter 1, Jesus is identified as part of God's ongoing work in human history. We see this when Matthew lays out the genealogy of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 2, we see that Jesus is sought after by some very unlikely people, the wise men or the astrologers from the east. And we see that Jesus is violently opposed by Herod and the empire that Herod represents. Herod wants to protect his own power. In Matthew chapter 3, Jesus is identified by God as God's own Son, and his work is authenticated by God's Spirit at his baptism. And then in Matthew chapter 4, we see Jesus is opposed by the devil. Jesus is geographically located in Galilee, and Jesus is theologically identified as one in whom Scripture is fulfilled. So this is Jesus so far in the Gospel of Matthew. What does Jesus do? In Matthew chapter 4, he calls disciples to follow him. He proclaims the good news of God's kingdom or God's community. In Matthew chapter 4, he also heals people. He casts out demons. And then when we get to Matthew chapter 5, in verse 1, he teaches from the mountain. Because Matthew has already linked Jesus and Moses so closely together, when Jesus goes up the mountain, Matthew's audience will be remembering Moses going up Mount Sinai to receive the law, these words of God that formed the identity of God's people in the Old Testament. Now remember that the law given at Mount Sinai defined the heart and the behavior of God's people, but following the law was not a prerequisite for God's provision in Exodus. God had already rescued the Israelites from Egypt. Instead, the law was how the people would live because God had already rescued them. In the same way, when Jesus goes up the mountain, he will describe the heart and the behavior of God's people, not so that the people would know how to earn God's favor, but because the people already recognized God's saving action in the world. Jesus is presenting God's kingdom as a contrast to the tyranny of empire. This time it's not Pharaoh's empire, it's the Roman Empire. Now, the Sermon on the Mount is not a manual for overthrowing the empire. That's God's work. Instead, the Sermon on the Mount invites God's community to imagine another way of being human together, despite the demands of empire. So how is it that Jesus' community is in contrast to this empire? How do Matthew's Beatitudes specifically turn the assumption of empire on its head? Let's take a look at the Beatitudes in two sets. We have the first four, verses 3 through 6, and then the second four, verses 7 through 10. The first set of Beatitudes are reversals. They describe circumstances in life, not circumstances that anyone would ever seek out, but they describe the reality of life for some people. Now, normally we might expect to hear, "Blessed are the ones who care for the poor in spirit. Blessed are the ones who offer comfort to those who mourn." But in these Beatitudes, describing God's community, It is the powerless who are said to be blessed or favored by God. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the ones who are so hopeless that they feel that they're on the verge of giving up. Blessed are those who mourn, those who find in their lives no source of joy. Blessed are the meek. The word meek is a little more difficult for us. We don't use it very often in common speech. Probably Jesus is thinking of one here who is humiliated or powerless, someone who has been disinherited, or those who have been denied their share. Blessed are the meek. And then fourth, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. We could understand the word righteousness here in a couple of different ways, but if we're following along the pattern set by these first four Beatitudes, Jesus is probably talking about those who are desperate for God's right action. In other words, those who are desperate for God to put things right. God's coming kingdom is good news, especially for these people. They are valued and cared for by God as they are. And in this community that Jesus is describing, they will find hope and joy and justice. Now, the second set of Beatitudes shift toward action. In verses 7 through 10, Jesus describes how people in his community will act toward others. People who act like this are blessed. They receive God's favor. Notice that the characteristics described here are just about opposite from the behavior that is prized by empire. Blessed are the merciful, those who do not exact judgment, those who forgive debts, those who act in ways of unmerited kindness and compassion toward others. And this action, we should say, is not limited only to followers of Jesus. Those in Jesus' community will extend mercy to all. Second, blessed are the pure in heart. In other words, those who are truly pure, not just those who appear to be pure. The focus here is probably on integrity, especially in terms of one's actions toward others. Third, blessed are the peacemakers. Now, we might hear in peacemakers those who work to bring an end to conflict. And certainly there is a sense of this kind of peace in Jesus' words, but is that all that Jesus has in mind? There are lots of ways to bring about an end to conflict. In Roman terms, bringing peace meant an absence of conflict, but that peace was brought about by the power of the sword. The word that Jesus uses for peacemakers here is found only in this verse in the New Testament. So, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of other instances to compare to understand maybe how Matthew understands this word for peacemakers, or even other authors within the New Testament. But surely in Matthew's gospel, especially this Jewish-flavored gospel, we should consider the Hebrew concept of shalom when we think of peacemakers. Shalom is more than the absence of war or conflict. Shalom involves creating a dwelling place, a place where people can dwell together and can dwell with God. Jesus' peacemakers bring about security and welfare not by wielding the sword, but by doing the difficult and unending work of justice. And lastly, Jesus says, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. If we carry over the sense of righteousness from verse 6 as God's work of setting things right, then we might understand this eighth beatitude to describe what we can expect when we join God in the work of setting things right. Now, you might notice in verse 11 that there is one more statement about who is blessed. But notice that Jesus shifts to use the second person pronoun in verse 11. Blessed are you. In this verse, Jesus addresses his disciples more personally. The verses before have described those who will be in Jesus' community, but how will this affect the disciples? Well, if they work to build this new community, then they will be reviled, persecuted, and all manner of evil things will be said about them. The work to which Jesus calls his disciples is not easy, but it is the work of God. We see a lot of irony in the Beatitudes and in the whole Sermon on the Mount. actually throughout all of the Gospels. When what we expect is contrary to what happens, we might say that that event is ironic. The irony in the Gospels is based on paradox, though not on pure contradiction, a paradox that is embodied in Jesus' teaching and ministry. How can a community be strong if some of its most valuable members are the poor and the marginalized? Certainly a strong community doesn't include tax collectors or prostitutes or a homeless man that lives among the tombs or a hot-headed, uneducated fisherman or a close follower who would betray his leader for 30 pieces of silver. And yet it is with these people that Jesus builds his community. The crucifixion is perhaps the greatest example of paradoxical irony. The idea that ultimate power might be found in ultimate love and sacrifice was a paradox foreign to the Roman Empire, and it is foreign to our cultural assumptions today. Jesus teaches with his words and his actions that the first will be last and the last will be first. So how do we practice the Sermon on the Mount? How do we begin to realize the truth of the Beatitudes in our own community? Sometimes the Sermon on the Mount has been thought of as an eschatological ideal, a state of existence and community that would only be possible when Jesus comes again. Others have thought of the Sermon on the Mount as an impossible set of requirements that only a super Christian could ever hope to fulfill. But if we understand the Sermon on the Mount as coming from the Jesus that we know through Matthew's Gospel, and if we understand it to describe a way of life that is an alternative to the brutality of empire, then the Sermon on the Mount becomes an invitation. As you study the Sermon on the Mount this week, especially the Beatitudes, consider it an invitation to creatively and courageously choose the priorities of God's kingdom over the priorities of empire. This podcast is produced by Good Faith Media. Learn more at goodfaithmedia.org.
There, you can find a wealth of additional resources, including the 12-volume Nurturing Faith Commentary by longtime lesson writer Tony Cartledge.
It covers every text for every Sunday in the 3-year cycle of the Revised Common Lectionary.
Our podcast music comes from Pond 5. Check out the show notes for more information,
including a transcript and a few other tips for studying Scripture.